topic tonight focuses on free people of color. So let's start with a basic definition of what that means. A free person of color was someone who was non-white and not a slave in the Old South. So we say free person of color instead of free black because you had people who might be defined at one point or another as black and free. You had folks who were labeled with the term mulatto, which is now a very dated term. We actually don't like to use it. But it referred to someone who might be biracial or triracial. And of course, that opens the possibility of folks who had some degree of indigenous heritage. But these were otherwise folks who were non-white. Their stories have largely been forgotten when we think about the history of the Old South. We think about plantations and enslaved people. We tend not to think so much about the population, albeit small, of people of color who were free. I think that their stories are important because they speak to resilience and character, living amid a regime that was really set against them in a lot of ways, and I'm going to talk about that in a few moments. My interest in free people of color actually emerged during my first year of graduate school. I went into grad school thinking I was going to study the American Revolution, and then I ran across my own family, the Dangerfields themselves, in a book that I was assigned in my second semester, Stephanie McCurry's Masters of Small Worlds. And I later found out that this family story was also included in the foundational work. If you're going to study Southern history, everything starts with U.B. Phillips' book, American Negro Slavery. And for the last 100 years, historians have been figuring out how he was wrong about this and that, and most of the time he was. But my family was in there, and reading about my family's interactions with free people of color got me interested in how free people of color compared economically and socially with non-elite whites in the Lowcountry. I started that project in 2009, and I've been working to understand their complicated lives ever since. I'm not going to bore you with my work on agricultural history and how much corn people grew and the amount of cotton they grew. What I'm going to do tonight is introduce you to some free people of color, try to give you some interesting stories that illustrate how these families became free in the first place, and what their economic positions were like, what their social positions were like, and then close with the increasingly tight legal restrictions that they faced in the 19th century. So let me introduce you here to Moses Jackson. This is an excerpt from the 1850 federal population census, and you can see his name, his wife, their gender, and their race. 42 years old, living in St. John's, Berkeley Parish, more or less on what's now the Cane Bay subdivision. And he's described, along with his children, as mulatto. So he's non-white, perhaps not necessarily identified as black, but being counted and named in the population census before 1870 tells us that he's free. And he is described with this identifier as mulatto, which was much more common to see in the slave censuses for enslaved people. So we automatically know that his condition, his family's condition, was very complicated, because in South Carolina law at the time, free and person of color was a contradiction in terms. I'm going to read you a quote from who at the time was the highest judge in South Carolina, John Belton O'Neill. In 1848, he wrote a tract summarizing what was then called the Negro Law of South Carolina. And he said that color is basic evidence that a person bearing the color of a Negro, mulatto, or mestizo is a slave. In other words, a person bearing the color black, mulatto, or mestizo was automatically assumed under the law to be a slave. To give you an idea of how many of these people there were, we'll go back to our 1850 figures. There were just under 394,000 people of color living in the state of South Carolina in 1850. Just under 9,000 of that number were free. The rest were enslaved. So very, very, very small segment of the antebellum population, often overlooked. But what we see in their experience is they have freedom, but they seldom enjoy meaningful degrees of equality. Understanding that paradox deepens our understanding of antebellum South Carolina society. Their positions and the increasingly oppressive social and legal conditions that they faced in the 1800s were closely tied to the state's more strident defense of slavery itself. Later in this talk, I'm going to refer to them as barometers, because the positions that they had under the law in the 19th century got worse and worse as time went on. And that was a direct result of South Carolina tightening down and getting more and more defensive of the institution of slavery. And what we really see is that the state government resented having a population of free African Americans and free people of color living in their midst. So we'll return to Moses Jackson later in this talk. I'll introduce you to some things that his family did later on to talk through some themes. But let's start with freedom's origins. How do these people become free in a society where to be a person of color was to be a slave? The most common way that a person of color became free was called manumission. This was a legal process where an enslaver could set free an enslaved person, basically through a deed or property transfer, a legal signage selling or freeing a person in court records. Another very common method at the time was, at the time of death, an enslaved person would be set free through a last will or testament. Enslavers granted manumissions for a variety of reasons. Some of them very simply would say this was in exchange for money. If an enslaved person had been able to squirrel away some cash and purchase themselves, sometimes it was stated that it was in reward for years of service or loyalty. Owners who allowed enslaved people to self-purchase, not as common, I think, but probably the most famous example of this was in 1799. An enslaved man named Denmark Vesey won the East Bay Lottery, took his winnings, and bought his own freedom. I should also note that 70%, at least in the Lowcountry, 70% of the free person of color population was described not as black, but as mulatto. And what that indicates to you is enslavers were freeing biracial children. There was also a brief uptick in the number of manumissions during the Revolutionary War period. This is a very brief moment when enslavers really bought into the idea of equality. It wasn't widespread, but there were some who genuinely bought into that idea and were freeing their enslaved property. That moment was very, very short-lived because of a number of factors. Part of it is a defense of slavery that's going to develop very shortly after the American Revolution. Some of it is because of the invention of the cotton gin, which I'll talk about in a few moments. But let's talk about what an actual manumission might look like. I mentioned my own family story. The image that you see on top there is an excerpt from the will of Morton Wilkes Smith from 1816. The wills were transcribed during the New Deal, so that's why I have a nice typed out copy. Maybe you'll read that. He says that he wanted to free his female servant, Hannah, who he heired by the death of my pious and good parents, Mrs. Jane Smith, be immediately after my death liberated and set free, and her children forever. He actually went out of his way to set aside money in case any person had a claim of debt on Hannah, so that if anyone ever tried to say, look, place a lien on her, basically, he had money set aside so that that lien could be, debt could be paid off. Hannah was actually my great-great-great-grandmother. She was born on Edisto Island on the estate of William Elliott Eddings. And after she was set free, she married a Dangerfield, who could blame her. And had several sons with my great-great-great-grandfather. Underneath this excerpt from the Smith will is a will from 1823 from Vincent Peter. Vincent Peter was a white man living in the city of Charleston. And in his will, he did something that you don't see very often. He actually acknowledged that he was freeing biracial children that he fathered with an enslaved woman named Betty. And he dictated that they were legally set free. He did this in his will strategically. If there was any doubt about his children's status and whether or not they should be free, they could refer back to this court record when the will was entered and probated that, look, our former owner, albeit their father, was admitting or testifying in his will that they were legally free. It's interesting in this will, he did not free the mother of his children, Betty. And I think that leaves some questions about the nature of their relationship, and I think it's a cautionary tale for us to think deeply when we encounter these sexual liaisons between enslavers and enslaved women. These relationships were not always romantic partnerships. One of the other reasons that he took pains to leave this record spelling out that his children were indeed free is by the 1820s, it was much more difficult for an enslaver to free enslaved property. In fact, by 1820, to be legal, it had to have individual approval from the legislature itself. Most free people of color in South Carolina could trace their freedom or their family's freedom to a manumission, but there are some other origins. Some, particularly in the Lowcountry, actually arrived with white planters fleeing the Haitian Revolution together, the slave rebellion in Saint-Domingue. And there were a couple, not very many, but a couple of free families in the Lowcountry that had traveled even farther. This image is another composite from the 1850 census. This one is from St. Stephen's Parish, a little bit farther north in Berkeley County, and it's the Cleveland family. You see James Cleveland, his age, his gender, his race, his occupation, an approximation of the property value that he held, and his birthplace, South Carolina. What's really interesting about this story is all the way at the bottom of the screen. I don't know if you can make that out, but his mother, Kate Cleveland, was 95 years old in 1850, and her birthplace was Africa. Kate Cleveland came to South Carolina with her aunt, Elizabeth Cleveland. It's a very fascinating story. Elizabeth Cleveland was remembered as the biracial daughter of a white English sailor and slave merchant named William Cleveland, and her mother was a biracial African woman named Kate. Elizabeth Cleveland was born in 1741 on the Banana Islands, just off the coast of Freetown, Sierra Leone. Her father sent her to be educated in Liverpool, England, and later sent her to South Carolina along with enslaved property and wealth that could be used to purchase a plantation. With Elizabeth Cleveland came the niece, Catherine, the Kate that we see here. By 1768, Elizabeth Cleveland had purchased a 750-acre plantation called Brick House in her brother's name. And she also acquired another 600 acres known as Wampee, which is now on the tip of the Panopolis Peninsula outside of Moncks Corner. She brought considerable wealth and land into her 1771 marriage with a white surgeon named William Hardcastle. And as her husband practiced medicine in the St. John's Berkeley district and St. Stephen's Parish, she evidently worked along beside him and learned basic skills as a medical provider. In fact, after her husband died, white planters from St. John's Berkeley were known to go to her for medical care. Her wealth and her status in the community allowed her to do things that under the law and under the social conditions were absolutely unheard of. For example, she witnessed legal documents, signed as a witness in legal documents for white planters. This was unheard of in this day. This was an era when free people of color had basically no rights in the courts. They couldn't testify for or against whites, and here she is signing as a witness. When she died in 1808, her biracial niece, Catherine, or Kate, faced a lengthy legal fight to protect the tract of land called Raccoon Hill that she was set to inherit. It was a losing fight in many respects because their rights in the courts were so limited. She was finally able to secure this small farm in 1825, and her will, Kate Cleveland's will, that was written in 1836 and probated after her 1859 death, indicated that the family, the James Cleveland, her son that we just saw, was still farming the land. And the family evidently held on to that small farm until the surrounding land was flooded to form Lake Moultrie. If you visit Lake Moultrie, you'll know that Raccoon Hill still peers above the water. Locals call it Coon Island. They have a heritage festival out there. Isn't that right, Andrew? Don't they have a big, I think all the rednecks get together and have a boat concert. I would never be involved in such a thing. Among free people of color in the South Carolina Lowcountry, very, very few arrived directly from Africa. But there is another family I want to talk to you about for just a moment tonight, just because we're on Daniel Island and this would have been St. Thomas and St. Denis Parish. The parish was home to a group of interrelated families that owed part of their freedom and wealth to Anglo-African origins. In 1770, an Englishman named John Holman was living in Rio Pongo, West Africa, just north of Sierra Leone. And he was a well-established slave trader. His interest in the Atlantic economy and slave trade meant that he was acquainted with a prominent South Carolinian and prominent slave trader, Henry Lawrence, the wealthy planter who owned Metkin on the Cooper River, as well as several other properties, basically from here to what's now Florida. Lawrence advised him that year to invest his profits in a rice plantation. He said, it's going to make you rich. It took Holman a little while, but he finally heeded Lawrence's advice and purchased the Blessing Plantation on the Cooper River in 1787. He paid 2,500 pounds British sterling for property near the east branch of the Cooper and French Quarter Creek. After the purchase, Holman actually returned to Africa to continue his slave trading business on Rio Pongo. But 2 years later, he left Africa again, and this time, bound for South Carolina, he took his family with him, his African wife, Elizabeth, and their 5 biracial children. Given that South Carolina had closed the international slave trade in 1787, Holman could not bring his family into the colony without some special help. He leaned on his relationship with Henry Lawrence. He also wrote a petition directly to the legislature for special dispensation, special permission to bring his family into the colony, which they granted in 1791. He probably brought them in as enslaved people, not as free, and needed the legislature's permission to do just that. The Holman family's wealth and their ties with Lawrence gave them a degree of advantage here in the Lowcountry, but his marriage and his biracial children probably frustrated his social welcome into planter society on the Cooper River. So it's not surprising that when his children came of age, they intermarried with another local family with nearly identical circumstances. Robert Collins, another white planter, owned some 550 acres in St. Thomas and St. Denis Parish, and even more in Georgetown. And he himself was married to an enslaved woman. 2 of Collins' sons and one of his nephews, a man named James Anderson, were married to Holman's 3 daughters. My colleague Larry Koger has written that these unions literally wedded a property-owning and slave-owning class of free black families, conditions that were obviously favorable for their continued economic prosperity. So what does their economic prosperity look like? Well, Elizabeth Cleveland Hardcastle and the Hallman and Collins families were rare examples. These are rare examples of free people of color who had considerable degrees of wealth. They used their land, they used enslaved people's labor to grow rice and other cash crops in much the same way that white planters did. But like the white population in Antebellum, South Carolina, the majority of free people of color were not of the planter class. They weren't wealthy. Most of them, in fact, the majority in the rural Lowcountry, looked more like Moses Jackson or Hardcastle's nephew, James Cleveland. They might have owned a small piece of land or had access to rent it. They might have even owned an enslaved person or two. But these small farmers and their families were the primary workforce on their farms. They grew food that they could eat before they risked their limited resources, be it land or labor, on cash crops. And they probably supplemented their farm with some sort of skilled labor, like blacksmithing or carpentry work, to bring in a little bit of extra cash. Moses Jackson's ability to support himself revolved around a piece of property that he purchased in 1848, a 361-acre tract of land in St. John's, Berkeley Parish. And again, this is on or near the Cane Bay subdivision, which is along Highway 176 in between Moncks Corner and Somerville. You can see from the plat that most of the land was not rich plantation land like we would find along the Cooper River. They didn't have access to the tidal flow for growing rice, tidal rice and wealth. And in short, most common class or non-elite whites farmed the same way that Jackson did. They farmed land that the planter class simply didn't want. Half of Jackson's tract is described here as either swampland or lowland bay, but he made the most of it. He worked beside his wife and later his sons and a daughter to make the soil produce their livelihood. They were growing corn, raising herds of livestock, and they grew a respectable 1,800 pounds of inland rice. The plat of Jackson's property also reveals another strategy that helped free people of color make their way in Antebellum, South Carolina. They formed little communities. We can see the property bordering Jackson's land. He's surrounded by other families that are identified, households that are identified as free people of color in the 1850 census. This is a similar free person of color community in St. Stephen's Parish. We see Kate Cleveland's land there on the left. That was Raccoon Hill, and very nearby were other free person of color families, property owned by the Eady and Locklear families. Cooperative living within the rural Lowcountry offered some degrees of protection for free people of color, but that was not absolute by any means. And in fact, the hardships of living under the legal conditions that they did, and I'm going to describe those in a little more detail in a moment, but it actually drove the majority of free people of color to move into the city. So, in the 1850s, there were only about 420 free people of color living in the rural parishes, basically what's now rural, well, it's not rural anymore, outside of the city of Charleston and what's now Charleston County, what's now Berkeley County and Dorchester County, which is hard to think of these places being rural. 420 lived outside of the city. About 4,000 lived on the peninsula itself. And like their rural counterparts, they worked hard to make a living. Some of them were teamsters, launderers, artisans, dock workers, craftsmen. A few of them achieved significant economic success as entrepreneurs and business owners. One famous example of this is J.B. Jones, who operated a hotel at 71 Broad Street, and he served wealthy white patrons for the first half of the 19th century. They also, like their rural counterparts, formed tight-knit communities, even inside of the city, to protect themselves. Probably the most famous example of this is Charleston's Brown Fellowship Society, which was founded in 1790. It started out as sort of a de facto burial insurance association. If a member of the society died without the means for a proper burial, the other members would step up. But over time, it evolved into a fraternal organization that fostered business relationships, entrepreneurial ventures for the free black community in Charleston. So what about their legal conditions? We've seen glimpses of the growing restrictions already. I talked to you about John Hallman having to ask direct permission from the legislature to bring his family into the colony. I mentioned Elizabeth Cleveland Hardcastle's estate and the battle that her heirs went through when white planters from the community challenged the legality of her will and estate, and it left her niece with only the small farm to inherit. And I mentioned several times that conditions got worse and worse through the 19th century for free people of color. So what happened? Several things at once. First of all, the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution in the 1790s caused the planter regime to worry about what would happen if people of color had their freedom. They worried particularly that those still enslaved would see free blacks and basically want freedom for themselves, which I think is sort of silly in their thinking, because I don't think they would have needed a free example to want to be free, but this was the impact of the Haitian Revolution in part. Another factor that emerged in the 1790s into the early 19th century is the development of an ideology called paternalism. In the Revolutionary era, most of slavery's defenders, Henry Lawrence, for example, would tell you that slavery was a necessary evil. Lawrence actually wrote a letter to his son, John Lawrence, at one point and said, "I abhor slavery. I hate it, but it's the way things are." As time goes on and abolitionism takes hold in the United States, slavery's defenders are less and less willing to admit that slavery was evil. And in fact, they developed an ideology to defend slavery called paternalism, which argued that slavery was not a necessary evil, but in fact was a positive good. They argued, and I have to say that this is very racist ideology. The tenets that underpinned it were terribly racist, but they believed that people of color actually needed white care or oversight. They believed white people needed to look out for people of color. They believed that the relationship between enslaver and enslaved was akin to the relationship between a father and needful children. The other factor that caused things to get worse and worse for people of color, free people of color in the early 19th century is very simply the invention of the cotton gin. The cotton gin allowed for short staple cotton to become a profitable cash crop in the inland South. And this meant not only does cotton expand throughout the deep South, but the need for enslaved people to pick and work the cotton fields grew as well. So you have just an economic decision where enslavers, therefore, because of the economics and the growing demand for enslaved people and the price going up, they're less and less willing to part with their property. So together, all three of these factors result in legal restrictions that were designed first and foremost to decrease the free black and free person of color population. So the first thing the legislature did was crack down on manumissions. South Carolina slave law dated, for the most part, all back to 1740. The year after the Stono Rebellion, South Carolina issued this comprehensive law governing not just the enslaved population, not just the free person of color population, but the Negro Act of 1740 and the revisions that we're going to see, I'll talk about in a moment, they govern the white population as well. They dictate to the white population how they can and cannot relate to the enslaved and to free people of color. Some of that regard, we're not allowed to teach enslaved people how to read, right? It limits white behavior too, right? They also limited manumission. Starting in 1800, what's known as the Act of 1800 revised the Negro Act of 1740. In 1800, the legislature said, if you want to free enslaved property, you have to have permission from a local jury. And they argued, well, this is primarily because we have unscrupulous slave owners who are waiting until enslaved people get really old, can't take care of themselves, and are setting them free so they don't have to take care of them. And they said, we want the jury to hear testimony that this is a person of good character and that they can and will work to support themselves, right? So there's that paternalism ideology creeping in. What's really behind it is they're trying to crack down on the number of manumissions that are taking place. They're trying to stop the growth of the free black and free person of color population. They revise it again in 1820, and they say any emancipation or any manumission has to have direct approval from the legislature, which they very, very, very rarely were willing to give. The funny thing about both of these laws, remember, these laws limited white behavior as well, right? And there's this ethic among the planter class that property rights, that sort of thing, government can't tell us what to do with our property. If we wish to set them free, we'll do it anyway. So despite both of these laws, like Vincent Peters' will, you see enslavers continue, not terribly widespread, but we see them continue to free some enslaved people despite the law. And most of the time they were doing it by way of their last will and testament. So the legislature in 1841, in response to petitions from local communities, passed another revision that dictated emancipation by wills, and what they call secret trusts were outlawed, prohibited, closed all of the loopholes, and it went a step farther. Any person who was not legally free was subject to seizure and re-enslavement. Other changes to the legal conditions in South Carolina for free people of color. Obviously, they weren't allowed to vote. They had very limited rights in the courts. And they also passed a law requiring a tax called a capitation tax. You'll sometimes hear it referred to as a poll tax. $2 a year that was levied on you simply because you were a free person of color. And again, the rationale that was given was, well, this is to encourage people of color who are free to work, right? To be industrious and support themselves. The paternalism creeping in. Really what they were after was trying to discourage free people of color in South Carolina and induce them to leave the state altogether. And by the way, if a free person of color left South Carolina after the mid-1820s, they were not allowed to come back, right? This is a tax return from 1824 from Robert Collins, St. Thomas, St. Denis Parish. You can see that he paid tax, 75 cents each, property tax on 9 enslaved people, and had to pay a tax on himself and his spouse, $2 each. For some, this was indeed a hardship. And we see that free people of color actually tried to get out of this, a variety of strategies. I've seen one gentleman, bird walking a little bit, ask for permission to be excused from the capitation tax, and the legislature wrote back and said no. So he wrote another petition and said, but I'm a Revolutionary War veteran. I served the colony during the war, and I was faithful, and the legislature said, okay, we'll let you buy. He asked permission to free his children and his wife. The legislature said no. He wrote back, but I'm a Revolutionary War veteran, and the legislature said okay. So it wasn't absolute, but for the most part, it was a hardship for the vast majority of free people of color. There were actually worsening conditions. I think probably the worst decade was the 1850s. Free black mechanics inside the city of Charleston were victims of a petition by Irish mechanics. They asked the city government to crack down on economic competition and force the capitation taxes, basically shut down our competition. There were calls in the legislature, not just in South Carolina, but in other southern states in the late 1850s, to either force all of the free black population to leave the state or potentially re-enslave them, just wholesale re-enslavement. That, combined with the economic stress that was brought on it, things were difficult for small farmers and non-planter class folks, white and black, in the late 1850s. Economic conditions and legal hardships drove a few, not many, but a few, free people of color to actually petition the legislature in the late 1850s and ask permission to sell themselves back into slavery, or sell themselves into slavery. And this was for a variety of reasons, but that threat that they were going to be expelled from the state, one thing is it meant they might be separated from family who were still enslaved, and they would rather become an enslaved person than be separated from a spouse or from children. I wanted to give you one final story I think is really interesting from St. John's Berkeley Parish to talk about how hard conditions were by the late 1850s. Moses Jackson's sons go to church one morning at Appii Methodist church that they'd attended before. And this particular morning, they're told, you cannot sit with the whites anymore, you have to sit with the black congregants. And these were men who, because of their father's fairly successful small farm, his land ownership, had a little different social condition than they might have had 10 years before. They were more accepted. But for some reason, this right that they'd earned over the years was revoked that morning, and they were told, you can't sit with the whites anymore, you have to sit with the blacks. And they took exception to that because that meant that not only their social condition, but their legal condition would suffer as well. So they took exception to this invitation to sit elsewhere and started a fight. I told you this was a Berkeley County topic. They were charged with rioting. And it goes to trial, and the trial judge tells the jury, I don't want you to discover whether or not they started a fight. Everybody knows they did. I want you to determine if they were white. Because if they were white, they had the right to defend their rights and their status. If they were not white, then they didn't. The jury goes back, can't make a decision. Second trial convicts them and determines that they were indeed guilty, they were non-white, and they had to pay a fine. That sort of trial was not uncommon at all in the 1850s because your race and your legal status went hand in hand. And we have, with so many free people of color who weren't necessarily defined as black, not necessarily defined as white, they're sort of in the middle, they could float between. And the courts were there to make a decision if there was ever any sort of question about where folks belonged. The Lowcountry's free person of color community, I think, are living proof that paternalism and the racist ideology that underpinned it were fiction. Their stories are important not only for that reason, but they also really are a barometer. They're sort of like the canary in the mine shaft for how conditions are going to be for the enslaved and the slave regime's commitment to slavery as we approach the Civil War. And I think they are also important and should be remembered because despite those hardships, they exhibited a strength and perseverance that we need to remember. Thank you so much. I will be glad to take some questions if we have. Do we have time, Deb?
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned marriage. I thought it was illegal for blacks and whites to be legally married.
So in many southern states it was. South Carolina, it actually was not illegal for free people of color to marry whites. There were repeated calls to the legislature to outlaw the practice for various reasons. They never made that decision. An interesting point about marriage. So Kate Cleveland, you might have picked up on, she kept the name Cleveland. And her children kept the name Cleveland. We don't know who her spouse or partner was. But free women of color particularly, because their legal rights were already so limited, and their access to property was also not so easy, they were less willing to get married and relinquish their autonomy over, their sovereignty over their property, if you will. I hope that answered.
So then, so if they were enslaved legally, they could not marry a white
Yeah,
person.
slaves, no, couldn't
But
either.
if they're a free person of color, they could marry someone
Yeah.
white. Did that ever change? Did they change that at all?
You know, I don't know. Something tells me that in the 1895 Constitution it was probably outlawed, but I would have to go back and look. I would not be surprised. The other, so I'll ramble a little bit more. So, the other interesting thing about these marriages, I ran across a petition from the 1830s from Sumter. And it was a woman who she'd been levied decapitation tax as a free person of color. The tax collector said, "You're not white, you don't pay the tax." And she said, "Oh, but I am white. Now my husband's black, but I'm white." And she wrote a petition to the legislature with 2 supporting affidavits from people who'd known her whole life and said, we know her to be a white person. And the legislature responded, "You're not white anymore, you married black."
Oh.
Race was socially defined. And the community, this is just the issue that these juries were hearing. Judges would tell juries, you don't make the decision based on skin tone. You make the decision based on all these other factors. Because race is the assumptions and prejudices that we attach to skin colors, not everything beyond that. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
In South Carolina, in the early 1800s, was there ever any talk of emancipation?
So, I'm glad you asked that. By the early 1800s, emancipation was a bad word in South Carolina. And part of it is the Haitian Revolution, part of it is the commitment to paternalism. If paternalism said and defended slavery on the basis that people of color needed to be enslaved, having a population of free people of color who clearly didn't need to be enslaved, were doing okay, proved that it was fictional. So it's but before the 1800s, there were some emancipations that were abolitionist in nature. There were a pair of merchants here in Charleston, Wadsworth and Turpin, who had enslaved people in their business, and in 1799, Wadsworth set free something like 24 enslaved families that the partnership owned, gave them land, farming implements, and livestock so that they could support themselves in the upstate. Of course, that would have been probably illegal in 1800 because of the Act of 1800. He would have had to convince a jury to allow him to do this, and I don't think he would have gotten it. Yes, sir.
You brought us up to the decade before the Civil War. You give us another 5 years worth. What was the situation during the Civil War?
So I'm actually working on an article-length project on that very question right now. I'm looking at non-whites. Some of them were people with clearly had African-American ancestry. Some of them identified themselves as having indigenous ancestry. But because their legal rights and status were tied to however they were identified racially, the Confederate draft in 1862 presented an opportunity for some of them because they were able to pass and they get drafted. And they go into the war as draftees and pass as white through the war. Now, these were people who, the ones I'm working on, were never identified as black. These were people who 1 year might be identified as biracial mulatto. 1 year or one document later, they might be identified as white and then back to person of color. But I found that if they were able to make it through the war, their descendants today usually identify as white or maybe identify as indigenous. But some of them were actually found out during the war, if you will, and kicked out of the firing line and made to drive wagons and things like that. So that's what I'm working on there. And this gentleman, Joel Bettenbaugh, was from Newberry County. He's one of the few free people of color I study where I actually have a photograph. He actually went north and joined with the United States colored troops, fought for the Federal Army, the Union Army, right? The United States. Yes, sir.
Property rights were obviously murky at best. How did that survive the, into Reconstruction and then the reimposition of Jim Crow?
That's a good question. Some of
We hear a
these-
lot about heirs property.
Oh,
Same
yeah,
thing?
That's another ball of yarn. Some of these folks are able to hold on to their property. The ones who have some property are able to hold on to it for a time. I think in the low country, something like 35 or 40% of the free black population lived in a household that had land. Some of them are able to hold on and keep farming it. Others aren't.
Weren't they vulnerable to legal challenge though?
As long as they're paying the taxes on it, not necessarily. Where it gets difficult is if, they don't have their affairs in order in a will. They were required to have guardians before the Civil War. The state required free blacks to have a white person sort of represent them in legal matters and keep an eye on them. I found that particularly in the countryside, free blacks were loath to have a guardian because it opened them up to that sort of predatory relationship. Where, and I've seen examples of this, where a person said, "Oh, I'm the guardian," and they take the property when somebody dies. So yes and no. The Hardcastle case is interesting. She had white relatives on her father's side who were planters in St. John's, Berkeley, and in Georgetown, the Kinlaws. And when she died, they go to the court and they said, no, we're the closest legal relatives. We should inherit. And that's what kicked it off there. Not a great answer, but thank y'all so much for having me. I appreciate it.